Welcome to Demystifying Iran. During the 12-Day War, the Israeli and U.S. regimes conducted military strikes against Iran's openly declared peaceful nuclear facilities, the first ever direct military attacks on active nuclear sites. The world looked to the UN nuclear watchdog for principle, for a condemnation of a dangerous precedent that could ignite a catastrophe. This is the same agency that has policed Iran's every centrifuge for decades and documented every nanogram of uranium. Yet when those very sites, internationally monitored and vulnerable to catastrophic radiation release, were bombed, the principle of protecting peaceful nuclear programs vanished. So we must ask, what is this crisis really about? It has never been about the fear of a weapon. It has always been about the weaponization of fear. For many years, we've been told a story of crisis, a story of looming threat, of a country hell-bent on building a nuclear bomb. The headlines are urgent, the warnings dire. But what if the story we've been told is a lie? What if this crisis is manufactured? Today we'll trace the history of Iran's nuclear program from its beginning to understand how we arrived at this moment. Iran is a full member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. This is not a minor detail, it is the legal bedrock. Article 4 of that treaty grants every member an inalienable right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, which includes uranium enrichment. Therefore, a central question looms over this decades-long confrontation. Is this about stopping a bomb or about denying a sovereign right? The thesis we will examine is stark, that a campaign led by the U.S. and triggered by the Zionist regime has been waged to illegally strip Iran of this recognized right. This campaign has a soundtrack, a warning on a loop for over 3 decades, most prominently from the Polish Zionist Benjamin Netanyahu, that Iran is just months away from a bomb. And yet, here's the fact that unravels the fear. Despite the most intense inspection regime in the IAEA's history, they have found no evidence that Iran ever planned to build a nuclear weapon. Therefore, the Iranian program, unlike the actual uninspected nuclear arsenal of the Israeli regime, has always been under continuous IAEA monitoring and within the NPT. This exposes a long-standing Western practice, deception and intelligence fabrication. We have seen this script before. The false weapons of mass destruction claims that justified the Iraq War is but one example. Now a similar playbook is used for Iran, featuring selective and twisted intelligence as well as fake allegations. In truth, the Western narrative of a nuclear threat from Iran is a deliberate and dangerous fabrication. It attempts to paint Iran as a global pariah, not based on legitimate evidence, but to serve fixed geopolitical interests, primarily those of the regime in Tel Aviv. Thus, the equation is clear. A strategy of perpetual pressure required a perpetual villain.
Iran is now trying to develop nuclear bombs. I think the United States should be very clear in forming an international coalition, with Israel, of course.
This country holds the undeclared status of the 8th nuclear power. And now, it not only openly declares that it won't allow any other country in the region to become a nuclear power, but it's also the only country in the world that has attacked the nuclear facilities of not 1, not 2, but 3 states, just out of fear that they might develop atomic weapons. Today we'll talk about Israel.
Iran's completed the first stage. Took them many years, but they completed it, and they're 70% of the way there. Now they're well into the second stage. And by next spring, at most by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb. In a decade, this deal will give an unreformed, unrepentant, and far richer terrorist regime the capacity to produce many nuclear bombs. In fact, an entire nuclear arsenal. That Iran has another secret facility in Tehran, a secret atomic warehouse for storing massive amounts of equipment and material from Iran's secret nuclear weapons program.
There's a Hebrew word for Israel's nuclear policy, amimut. It basically means deliberate ambiguity. Experts guess that Israel has between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads today.
Iran's nuclear program began in 1957 with a U.S.-backed nuclear cooperation deal, the Atoms for Peace Agreement, signed with the Shah's regime. Under this deal, the U.S. helped build Iran's first nuclear reactor in Tehran and fueled it with highly enriched 93% weapons-grade uranium. By 1960, the American support expanded to include the transfer of hot cells, chambers capable of separating plutonium from spent reactor fuel. Later agreements further committed the U.S. to providing an additional reactor and specialized training for Iranian nuclear scientists. In 1974, Iran established the Atomic Energy Organization to oversee this expanding program. Its staff grew rapidly to 4,400 by 1978, and dozens of specialists were sent to the U.S. for advanced training. With sustained American backing, Iran developed plans to build multiple nuclear power plants. Germany agreed to build the Bushehr power plant. France and others agreed to sell technology. Iran's nuclear ambitions were back then a celebrated symbol of modernity, fully supported by the West. There was no crisis. By 1979, Iran was creating the foundation for a full-scale civil nuclear program. Then comes the revolution, changing everything overnight. The crisis emerged not from a hidden lab, but from an anti-imperialist revolution in the streets. During his war of aggression, Saddam Hussein, who received extensive intelligence, financial, and material support from Western powers and their regional proxies, used chemical weapons on a massive scale against Iranian soldiers and civilians, as well as Iraqi civilians.
ما اهل بمب اتم نیستیم. ما با بمب شیمیایی مخالفیم. ما اون وقتی که عراق ما رو مورد حمله شیمیایی قرار میداد، ما اقدام به تولید سلاح شیمیایی نکردیم. با اصول ما این چیزا موافق نیست.
Mustard gas and nerve agents were deployed en masse. The victims were men, women, and children, suffocated, poisoned, burned, left to die in agony. The world saw the pictures, and the world, for the most part, remained silent. Iranians were being gassed with Western technology funded by wealthy Arab regimes. The West did not stop it. In fact, it enabled Saddam. Iran faced a major threat and possessed the technical capability to produce chemical weapons. By the prevailing Western strategic logic, the rational move would have been to rush to produce them. But Iran did not. Imam Khomeini prohibited the government and military from producing weapons of mass destruction. Iran made a conscious decision, moral and religious, not to go down that path. One may be cynical about religious decrees, but one cannot argue with the historical fact. During a war of survival, under significant duress, when every strategic incentive screamed yes, Iran chose no. Therefore, before one blindly accepts the modern Zionist and neocon narrative of an irrational regime hell-bent on a bomb at any cost, they must confront this inconvenient history. Consider the supreme test, The moment Iran had the most convincing reason to produce chemical weapons, it refused. The war ended. Iran entered the 1990s with its policy of strategic restraint already proven. Today, Iranian leaders point to the 2003 fatwa issued by Ayatollah Khamenei, which declares nuclear weapons haram or forbidden. Given this record of restraint and religious prohibition, we must ask, what is actually driving this manufactured crisis? This brings us to a pivotal and fabricated moment. In 2004, the U.S. and Israeli-backed Iranian terror group, known as the MEK, claimed to have obtained laptop documents about a secret nuclear weapons program. To understand the source, one must know its history. During Saddam's war of aggression against the newly established Islamic Republic, the MEK initiated a major terror campaign, murdering 17,000 Iranians. In 1986, they moved to Iraq and fought for Saddam against their own country. This was not a whistleblower. The MEK was and continues to be a U.S.-Israeli proxy. It has long waged war against Iran. 2 years earlier, this same group exposed 2 alleged secret nuclear facilities, an enrichment plant in Natanz and a heavy water reactor in Iraq. The international reaction, or more precisely, the Western reaction, was immediate shock. Headlines declared the discovery of a clandestine nuclear program, yet consistently omitted that the story was sourced from a U.S.-controlled terror organization, one that had betrayed Iran to fight for Saddam. This brings us to the crucial details that frame the entire so-called revelation. True, in August 2002, Iran had not declared these plans to the world. The screaming narrative of deception was thus sealed. But the law whispered a different truth. Under the IAEA Safeguards Agreement at the time, Iran was not yet legally obligated to declare them. This wasn't Iran's opinion. It was the finding confirmed by the IAEA's own Director General, Dr. Mohammad Marandi, in an official 2003 report. The rule in force was clear. A country only had to declare a new facility 180 days before introducing nuclear material. At the time of the so-called exposure, the bricks and cement at Natanz and Iraq were still rising. No nuclear material was present. Technically and legally, Iran was still within its window. This was a permissible secrecy. But how vital a secret could it truly have been? The Natanz facility was being constructed in plain sight, adjacent to a major highway. The shock was pure political theater, scripted from intelligence provided by a designated terrorist proxy with a clear agenda. It manufactured the image of a rogue state caught red-handed, when in legal reality Iran was operating in a permissible gray zone. Why the secrecy? This wasn't mere obstinacy, nor was it to hide a sinister objective. It was a calculated act to protect the peaceful and legitimate nuclear program, a necessity born from a long history of Western hostility, sanctions, and the tangible threat of military aggression. The precedent was stark: the Israeli regime's 1981 bombing of Iraq's Osirak reactor. That attack sent a chilling message to the entire region. A declared nuclear facility is a designated target. In such a climate, secrecy transforms into a legitimate defense. The legal gray zone Iran utilized wasn't merely a loophole, it was a shield. In addition, investigations by the IAEA and later admissions by U.S. intelligence officials revealed the laptop documents were likely fabricated. Western media, of course, showed little interest in this part of the story. This is the anatomy of a myth. amplify a politically charged revelation from a compromised source, repackage it as a legal bombshell, ignore the inconvenient details, then use that entirely manufactured crisis to justify a permanent state of confrontation. As a strategic concession to build trust, Iran has repeatedly offered to accept major and often quite controversial constraints on its nuclear program, a key gesture of goodwill aimed at de-escalating tensions. The first major agreement was reached in 2003, negotiated by President Khatami's administration with European powers. Iran committed to suspend all enrichment-related activities, swiftly implement the additional protocol, and provide a full declaration of its nuclear history, as detailed in an earlier IAEA Board of Governors resolution. In return, the Europeans accepted three largely unquantifiable reciprocal obligations: to assist in developing Iran's peaceful nuclear program, to support efforts toward a nuclear weapons-free region, and to resolve Iran's nuclear file at the IAEA. In the end, Iran fulfilled every one of its commitments. The Western side fulfilled not one. 7 years later, the pattern repeated. In the spring of 2010, President Obama tasked Brazilian and Turkish leaders with negotiating a nuclear deal based on a framework he had provided. The terms were specific. Iran would transfer roughly half of its low-risk uranium to Turkey. In return, it would receive fuel rods for a medical reactor. It was a small technical step, but a profound political one. For the first time in years, Iran was agreeing to ship its strategic uranium stockpile out of the country. Contrary to Obama's expectations, Iran accepted. He had been counting on a refusal. Consequently, his administration's response was to ignore the deal and instead push ahead with a new round of UN sanctions. Each time Iran moved towards accepting a limitation, each time it offered verifiable restraints as a confidence-building measure, it was met not with an open hand, but with a slap in the face. Escalated pressure, intensified sanctions, and deepened isolation. In 2013, the election of President Hassan Rouhani was followed by intense negotiations with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, the P5+1. The result in 2015 was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, a detailed agreement. Iran's obligations were sweeping: to severely reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, limit enrichment to 3.67%, permanently convert the Arak heavy water reactor, and accept the most intrusive inspection regime ever devised. In return, the P5+1's obligation was singular and clear: to dismantle the suffocating web of nuclear-related sanctions. For years, the IAEA repeatedly and explicitly certified Iran's full compliance with the deal. Under its terms, the core of Iran's peaceful nuclear program was effectively frozen. However, from the very beginning, Obama, but more importantly opponents of the deal in Congress, began to violate it by undermining the economic benefits Iran was promised. Ultimately, in 2018, U.S. President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the deal, reimposing and intensifying sanctions in a campaign of maximum pressure imposed against all Iranians. As a result, the deal collapsed.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Iran, squeezed and seeing no economic benefit, began a calculated incremental response in 2019, expanding its peaceful nuclear activities. The assassination and martyrdom of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020 poured fuel on the fire, making negotiation unthinkable for the foreseeable future. The diplomatic landscape shifted again with the 2021 election of President Ebrahim Raisi. Under Raisi, Iran negotiated from a position of hardened grievance and significantly advanced nuclear capability. His stance was unequivocal. The U.S., which had shattered the deal, must first lift the nuclear-related sanctions verifiably and permanently. The talks produced a final text that was accepted by the EU's foreign policy chief, Joseph Borrell, who described the Iranian position as reasonable. Ultimately, however, U.S. President Biden declined to accept it. Having seen multiple agreements with the West collapse, Iran under President Raisi became more determined to deprioritize Western powers and build deeper relationships with partners in the global majority, joining both BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization during his tenure. Following President Raisi's demise and the election of President Masoud Pezeshkian, a new attempt was launched to resolve the nuclear issue through negotiation. His administration signaled a willingness to explore a path toward resolving the issue under the right conditions, seeking a balanced and honorable resolution. But even as Iran was beginning indirect diplomatic negotiations, the Trump and Netanyahu regimes were secretly conspiring against Iran and ultimately launched a murderous regime change war. For well over 4 decades, the United States and its allies have demonized and targeted the Islamic Republic of Iran over its independent foreign policy, its support for the oppressed worldwide, and its opposition to apartheid and genocide in Palestine. The collective punishment for these policies has taken many forms: maximum pressure sanctions, assassinations, cyber attacks, mass attacks by Western-backed Takfiri groups, and a recent 12-day war of aggression. Conversely, this is precisely why other countries such as Morocco, Turkey, the UAE, Jordan, and Qatar face no such sanctions. Undoubtedly, Western elites and legacy media will continue to promote fake narratives about Iran regarding terrorism, nuclear weapons, human rights, and whatever else Zionists and neocons want. But their reach is gradually fading. Iranians have come to the understanding that Washington never sincerely sought to resolve their differences, including over the nuclear program, and that Western hostility is ultimately driven by the endless demands of the genocidal Zionist regime. Nevertheless, the Islamic Republic of Iran will continue to protect its sovereignty, as well as support the Palestinian struggle, a stance that more people worldwide are beginning to recognize and appreciate. See you next week.